One calm and quiet Saturday night, peace was forever shattered in a small New Mexico town. A single shot rang out, and a 21-year-old rookie police officer, Stephen Sandlin, was killed. From the first moment of the investigation, it seemed clear there was something dark brewing in the back alleyways and mountainous landscapes of Torrance County. Shot with his own service revolver inside the very police station where he worked, there were immediately suspicions cast in all directions. Had Stephen been the victim of a random crime, or had he been targeted, perhaps by someone he knew and trusted? Was his murder connected to drug traffickers with deep ties to the community and perhaps even with elected officials on the payroll? The investigations were massive, involving state police, the Attorney General's office, the Justice Department, and the FBI. Soon, a twisted web of lies, deceit, corruption, and threats called everything and everyone into question. From the chief of police to the sheriff to politicians and local residents, there was no one above suspicion. Missing evidence, anonymous calls, mysterious letters, confidential informants, and accusations of a cover-up threw a county into chaos. Now, more than 30 years later, perhaps the dust has settled long enough for the truth to be revealed and justice to be served. This is Trace Evidence, episode 167, The Murder of Officer Stephen Sandlin. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine one of the most complex, confusing, and frustrating cases I've ever dug into, the 1988 murder of Officer Stephen Sandlin. Before getting into the case, just a quick note about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter @TraceEvPod, Instagram @TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon at patreon.com/traceevidence, or you can donate directly via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or email me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. All his life, Stephen Sandlin dreamed of being a police officer. Then, just 8 weeks after realizing that dream, it was all taken from him in a moment of violent madness. This is episode 167, The Murder of Officer Stephen Sandlin. Stephen Alton Sandlin was born on Saturday, September 24th, 1966 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to parents Thomas and Eileen. The eldest born son, Stephen would go on to have 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. Stephen grew up in Bosque Farms, a village in Valencia County, 20 miles south of Albuquerque and 50 miles northwest of Mountainair. Stephen's father, Tom, was a police officer with the Albuquerque Police Department, and from an early age, Stephen both admired his father and sought to follow in his footsteps. According to Tom, as soon as his son was old enough to dress himself, he began trying to wear the uniform. Tom told the Albuquerque Journal how he'd laugh, looking over at his little boy as he climbed into his motorcycle boots, saying, quote, "He couldn't move in them yet, so he'd stand there and giggle. He'd put on my motorcycle helmet, and it would swallow him whole." End quote. It was clear from the beginning Stephen wanted to be a cop just like his dad, and that was a goal he was never going to shy away from. As the years progressed and he grew older, he may not have been running around the house in his father's uniform anymore, but he was beginning to ask serious questions about what he needed to do to get involved in law enforcement. Tom was supportive. A veteran of the Albuquerque police, he encouraged his son's pursuits, knowing that, even if he didn't, there was nothing that was going to change Stephen's mind. Stephen's been described as a smart, fun-loving, and playfully mischievous youngster and teenager. He could be a bit rambunctious, getting into trouble here and there, but never anything major. He enjoyed a good laugh and making others laugh, and he'd walk the line, pushing the envelope from time to time. But he also developed a solid belief in right and wrong and stood up for those he felt were being mistreated. Patrick Garcia wrote about his experience with Steve, saying, quote, "You always defended me in high school when older, bigger kids were picking on me. You would come from Bosque Farms to pick me up for school every morning when I was a junior and you were a senior. We rode together in your Camaro and had so many great times." End quote. Stephen, or Steve as he preferred to be called, went on to attend Sandia High School, where he maintained good grades and continued to build on his reputation, being a fun, kind, caring, and involved young man. In 1984, Steve would shift to El Dorado High School, from which he would graduate. He'd fall in love, dating fellow senior Michelle Sturdivant, and the two became almost inseparable, with dreams of a bright, long, and happy future. Following graduation, Steve maintained his interest in pursuing a career in law enforcement, and during the time between, he worked several different jobs for cable companies. In '86, when he was 20 years old, he and Michelle were thrilled to become parents, welcoming a son they'd named Robert. By all accounts, Steve was excited to be a father and wanted to raise his son in much the same way that he'd been raised. There was, of course, the wonder as to whether Steve would mirror his father's life, perhaps going on to watch his own son struggling to fit into his uniform. Unfortunately, Steve would never have the opportunity to experience that, nor would he be able to watch his son grow up. Less than 2 years would pass before the young father was cut down in his prime, ending a life that hadn't even begun yet. On Friday, March 4th, 1988, Steve, 21 years old, was beyond excited to announce he'd finally achieved his dream. He'd been hired on as a patrol officer with the Mountainair Police Department. Mountainair is a small village with a population of less than 1,200, seated in south-central Torrance County. Due to the small size of the village, the police force was also small, with Steve being only one of 4 officers on duty. For the most part, Mountainair police didn't really deal with a lot of high-level crimes, and much of Steve's early days on the force consisted of traffic duty. At the time, Steve was one of 3 employed there who had not yet been certified by the state as a law enforcement officer, and as such, he worked traffic, security, and did a lot of paperwork. With Mountainair being an hour's drive from Bosque Farms, Steve would take up a residence in the small village. At first, he moved in with Frank Peeler, a fellow officer who had joined the department a few months prior. The two lived together in a trailer not far from the station house, and through living, commuting, and working together, they quickly developed a friendship and tight bond. Steve was extremely happy to be a police officer and frequently talked with his father about the job, asking for advice and sharing stories. However, not long after first putting on the uniform, something changed, and Steve seemed to be a bit frustrated, suggesting to friends that maybe the job wasn't what he thought it would be. In his first weeks with the department, Steve had gained a bit of notoriety as he was issuing a high volume of traffic tickets. According to friends, some nights, he would park his cruiser near one of the local bars, and watching patrons leave, he'd often snag a few for moving violations and the occasional DWI. When Steve wasn't on the clock, he could often still be found at the station, catching up on paperwork and trying to stay on top of things. He wanted to learn, he wanted experience, and he wanted, to the best of his ability, to serve the people of Mountainair. What he didn't know at the time was that beneath the quiet and friendly veneer of Mountainair, there was a sinister operation ongoing, and those who tried to stand in its way were often met with threats, or worse. Not long after joining the force, Steve began to confide in friends that he and other officers had been receiving threats. According to the Albuquerque Journal, Steve and Officer Peeler had come home to their shared trailer several times and found anonymous notes stuck to the door threatening bodily injury or even death. Soon, it went beyond notes, with both officers saying that they'd begun receiving phone calls at home and at the station, from callers who would tell them to keep out of the way or find themselves dead. Ernie Lopez, a close friend of Steve's, later told the Journal, quote, "The notes would say that they didn't like them and they were going to kill them. They would get phone calls every day at the station, anonymous calls, saying they were all going to die." End quote. When Steve finally found his own place in Mountainair, just a few blocks south of Main Street, the threats did not stop. Steve would frequently come home after a long shift to find more notes stuck to his door and windows. The threats didn't seem to be showing any signs of slowing, and Steve began to worry about his safety and that of his family. It got to a point where he was looking over his shoulder so much that his own house began to lose its sense of security. As Lopez later explained, quote, "He even had a couple of notes on his door when he moved into his house. He was scared. He wouldn't even spend the night at his own house anymore." End quote. Despite the threats, Steve continued doing his job to the best of his ability. Just 5 weeks into his career, the rookie patrolman was about to make an arrest which would lead to a major search, which some believe might have been the impetus behind the young officer's murder. On the night of Monday, April 11th, 1988, Steve was on patrol in town and decided to wait outside the Rosebud Saloon, located just a tenth of a mile southeast of the Roosevelt Avenue police station. Not long after arriving, he observed a man exiting the bar, entering his vehicle and driving off. Based on the movements of the vehicle, Steve suspected that the driver might be intoxicated, so he turned on his lights and initiated a stop. The man behind the wheel was 40-year-old Melvin King of Manzano, who had prior arrests for both driving while intoxicated and drug possession. Upon stopping King, Steve approached the vehicle and asked to see his license. At some point, he noticed what appeared to be a bag of marijuana lying on the passenger floorboard, at which time he asked King to exit the vehicle as he would be arresting him for both driving under the influence and possession of marijuana. Less than 24 hours later, Mountainair police sought and received a warrant to search King's residence, located 18 miles north of town. The search, conducted the following day on Tuesday, April 12th, yielded overwhelming results. According to sworn affidavits, upon arrival, police found the home occupied by Susan Sprague, noted as being Melvin King's ex-girlfriend. Sprague received the warrant and consented to a search without argument. Depending on which account is accurate, between 50 and 54 pounds of marijuana was seized from the residence. In addition, documents stated that 117 newly potted marijuana plants, as well as weapons and explosives, were also found during the raid. The street value was estimated to have been approximately $50,000. As published by the Journal, an affidavit after the search reads, quote, "It is believed that King and Sprague are in a business association of distributing marijuana." End quote. 3 days after this search, police executed another search warrant, this time at the home of Susan Sprague, where they recovered a small quantity of hashish, a vial of cocaine, and paraphernalia. Sprague was then taken into custody and charged, while King was released on $100,000 bail. With Mountainair being such a small police department, they apparently didn't have the proper facilities to store the confiscated marijuana, and so, for 5 days, the 50 pounds of marijuana sat on the floor of the police station where it was guarded while officials attempted to find a more secure location. Among those who were charged with securing and guarding the contraband was Steve Sandlin and Frank Peeler. Mayor Richard Shovlin, when asked about this, later told the Journal, quote, "We tried to find a place to put it, but the state police wouldn't take it and the Attorney General's office wouldn't handle it." End quote. Ultimately, it was decided that the marijuana would be transported to the Torrance County Sheriff's Office in Estancia, where it was believed it would be secured in the county jail. Department records indicate that on Sunday, April 17th, both Steve and Peeler transported 4 large garbage bags of marijuana from Mountainair to the sheriff's office, where it was taken into custody by then Torrance County Undersheriff Gary Watts. At some point, Watts would move the evidence, not into the jail to be secured, but into a trailer in the impound lot. At the time, Watts explained, he was forced to store evidence and contraband in the locked trailer due to making room for a new juvenile holding area. When exactly the drugs were moved to the trailer has become a source of a lot of debate, with some accounts putting it in the trailer in April, and others saying it wasn't moved there until mid-May. This will become an important question later when much of that marijuana mysteriously vanishes. As April of 1988 changed into May, the Attorney General's office and the state police were receiving complaints from Mountainair citizens who accused the police department of mishandling evidence and excessively ticketing drivers. Lieutenant Mark Radosevich of the state police and Tom Gillespie, then the chief investigator for the Attorney General, were assigned to follow up on the complaints by heading down to Mountainair. Around this same time, Steve reached out to his father, Tom, for advice. While the conversation was vague, it seemed clear that something was bothering the young officer. Tom would later tell Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "The last time I spoke to Stephen, he indicated that there was something going on that he did not agree with down in Mountainair. He asked me what to do in that situation, and I basically told him to tell the truth." End quote. During this time, Steve continued to receive threats against his life, both at his home and while on the job. Close friend Ernie Lopez later told the Albuquerque Journal that on May 4th, 3 days before the murder, he spent the night at Steve's house. According to Lopez, Steve was scared to be alone. The threats may have played a role in a disturbing encounter Michelle had with her fiancé. Steve woke up in a cold sweat after a nightmare in which he said he had been shot in the head and killed. Michelle later told the Journal, quote, "He told me that it really scared him. He said it was someone he knew, but he couldn't tell what his face looked like." End quote. This dream becomes even more eerie because of how closely it mirrors Steve's final moments. On Friday, May 6th, Lieutenant Radosevich and Chief Investigator Gillespie were in Mountainair, where they interviewed Police Chief David Carson, Officer Edmundo Diaz, and Stephen Sandlin. It's never been revealed what exactly any of the officers said to the investigators, though it's been strongly implied that during his interview, Steve may have raised certain issues he had with the way things were being handled. In addition to discussing the allegations, Lieutenant Radosevich noted to the Journal that he also inquired about the arrest of Melvin King and discussed the marijuana seizure and the charges pending against King and Susan Sprague, though in what context no one has confirmed. The details of these discussions may shed valuable light on what happened next, as less than 24 hours later, Stephen Sandlin would be killed. On Saturday, May 7th, Steve was scheduled to work a swing shift, which would see him working traffic throughout some of the earlier part of his shift, and later that night, he'd work security alongside Frank Peeler for the town dance, set to take place in the building next to the police station. That afternoon, sometime between 2 and 3 p.m., Chief Carson called Stephen for a meeting. According to Carson, this wasn't a heated discussion or one in which Sandlin was being reprimanded. Carson was later quoted by the Attorney General's office describing the interview by saying that he told Sandlin that he was, quote, being too aggressive in writing traffic citations and the department was receiving complaints, end quote. In a later interview with Unsolved Mysteries, though, Carson said he didn't tell Steve he was writing too many tickets, explaining, quote, "What I told Steve was, Steve, slow down. You can't catch everybody. That's not your role. Just take it easy." And he seemed a little down about that, end quote. At the time, Chief Carson directed Steve to head back to the station and spend some time catching up on paperwork before heading out to work security for the dance. During the time that Steve and Peeler would be working security, Chief Carson and Officer Diaz would be on patrol. Following the discussion, Carson said that he went home for a few hours, noting his time of arrival as being 3 p.m. Several people spoke with Steve following this discussion, and all shared similar opinions. While Steve was frustrated with being, in his point of view, told to take it easy, he wasn't depressed about it. In fact, multiple witnesses would later report to investigators that in the hours leading up to his death, Steve was laughing and joking around. Steve arrived back at the station and proceeded up to the second floor, where he began finishing up paperwork as he'd been directed. During his time in the station, he made several phone calls, the final one being to his fiancée, Michelle Sturdivant. According to phone records from the station house, Steve picked up the phone and placed the call to his family's home in Bosque Farms at 6:45 p.m. Michelle picked up, and the two chatted, during which time Steve shared details about the meeting he'd had with Chief Carson hours earlier. According to Michelle, Steve was upset about being told to ease off a bit, but wasn't depressed or excessively angry about it. Steve explained that he planned to drive up to Bosque Farms the next day, Mother's Day, to celebrate with Michelle and his mother Eileen. Then, Michelle heard the sound of a woman's voice speaking loudly. She told the Journal, quote, "He said he was sitting in the chief's office, and then someone came into the room and he muffled the phone receiver with his hand. He got back on the phone and said, 'Oh, she was looking for town hall.' He then said he'd probably be up the next day and hung up. It was kind of abrupt, but we didn't think anything of it." End quote. While Michelle wasn't able to make out the full details of the conversation, she did report specifically hearing the woman saying his name, Steve. 21-year-old Eugene Butch Wright was a good friend of Dolan Carson, son of Chief Carson, and the two were on leave from the Army since April 26th, spending their time visiting the Carson family in Mountainair. According to Wright, during this visit, he was introduced to Steve and the two hit it off, with Wright coming by the station often and even accompanying the rookie officer on ride-alongs. According to Wright, he visited Steve at the station and planned to come back for a ride-along later, but first, he wanted to attend the talent show at the local high school with the Carsons. Attorney General's investigators later noted that Wright stated he spoke with Steve and left the station at approximately 6:40 p.m., 5 minutes before Steve made his last phone call to Michelle. According to a handwritten statement taken from Wright that night, he returned to the station a little over an hour later at approximately 7:45 p.m. Entering the slim corridor leading to the stairs, Wright reached the second floor, at which time he saw Steve, lying face down in a pool of blood. His service revolver, a .357 Magnum, was lying by his head. Wright immediately turned, racing back down the stairs to Steve's cruiser and grabbed the radio. Rather than calling out, "Steve's been shot," or "Officer down," or "We need an ambulance," or anything of that sort, Wright claims he radioed only one sentence: "Mountainair 1, Mountainair 4, respond to the office immediately." Mountainair 1 is Chief Carson, and 4 was the number of Steve's patrol unit. Wright later stated to investigators, quote, "I could hear him breathing, so I called his name. When he didn't respond, I ran down to his unit and reached through the window, which was partially open, and unlocked the door." End quote. After using the radio, Wright says he waited outside of the building. Less than a minute later, Chief Carson's unit screeched to a stop in front of the building, and both he and Officer Diaz jumped up, running up the stairs with Wright following behind them. I should note, the timeline here becomes confusing as, while Wright states that he arrived at the station at 7:45, Carson will later tell investigators that he responded as soon as he heard the call, claiming to have arrived at the station at 7:30. At the time when asked, Carson said he didn't respond to the call over the radio, instead making the decision to race to the station, which was less than a mile away. At 7:50 p.m., Officer Diaz radioed to Estancia, which houses the main hub for all law enforcement communications in Torrance County. There, a dispatcher keeps a log of all calls, though they're not recorded, and it's noted that Diaz reported an officer down and made a request for an ambulance. Logbooks show that within a minute of Diaz's call, Chief Carson made the same call. While radio calls into Estancia were logged, there was no system at the time of logging times and conversations communicated between individual patrol units, but several witnesses confirmed having heard Wright's call when he found Steve. Investigators from both the state police and the attorney general's office were sent to the scene. Several witnesses later told investigators that they heard Steve moaning, groaning, or making breathing noises when they arrived, between 7:51 and 7:55. The first paramedic on the scene was Richard Shevlin, also the mayor of Mountainair, who later reported that while he could not get a pulse from Steve, he did hear him moaning. Officer Diaz later said that when he arrived with Carson, Steve was still breathing. Paramedics rolled Steve over onto his back and began attempting to resuscitate him before he was taken down the stairwell and loaded into an ambulance to be rushed to the hospital. Tragically, by the time Dr. Robert Saul was able to begin working on Steve, he had already expired. His time of death was noted as being 8:12 p.m. Due to the fact that Sandlin was on the Mountainair police force and they couldn't examine the crime scene themselves, the investigation was taken by the state police. Evidence collection at the scene is another point of contention and debate in this case, with many people, both citizens and law enforcement officials, questioning the manner in which the scene was handled. James Yance, an investigator with the Attorney General's office, would later describe the handling of the crime scene as amateurish, telling the Journal, quote, "Things were looked at, moved, there were people standing around. I can't overemphasize the importance of the initial crime scene. It's almost sacred, and you'll never have it again. There was no evidence handling training in Mountainair. I'm accustomed to the crime lab being involved with this investigation, but it wasn't done the way the APD conducts their investigations." End quote. There were apparently also questions about the manner of death and the weapon used. While Steve's service revolver was found beside him, it was not initially clear whether or not the fatal shot had been fired from his gun, although the gun was bagged as evidence and it was noted that a single shell had been spent. Early on, theories were divided. While some believed that Steve had taken his own life, others believed that someone must have entered the station and somehow managed to shoot the officer with his own gun. Steve had been found in the center of the station, and there didn't appear to be any signs of a struggle. Nothing had been taken, and no one else is believed to have been in the building at the time. Investigators noted that there was only one way in and one way out, via the stairway leading to the street. That door was not locked, and according to at least one witness, around the time Steve is believed to have been shot, he noted that the door to the station was swaying in the breeze, as though someone had failed to close it properly. It was hoped that the autopsy, conducted by Dr. Chris Sperry with the Office of Medical Investigators, would shed some light on what happened, but those hopes would be quickly dashed as the autopsy would raise more questions than answers. The fatal shot struck Steve on the right side of his head towards the crown, with the autopsy noting that the bullet had formed a 1 1/4 inch gutter, striking at such an extreme angle that the bullet hit the bone and shattered into pieces, with some fragments lodging in Steve's brain. Beyond the bullet wound, the autopsy noted that Steve had a large bruise on his left cheek and a smaller one on his right, with the cause being listed as unknown, though some have speculated this could have been from when he fell to the floor. There was, however, another mark, described as a cut over his left eyebrow, which some speculated could have been the result of Sandlin either falling and hitting his head on a piece of furniture or perhaps having been struck with something before being shot. There was no furniture near his body when he was discovered, and everyone who was there early on has stated that his body was not moved until paramedics flipped him onto his back. Determining the position of the gun at the moment it was fired was a crucial piece of information, but the autopsy couldn't assist with that either, only being able to estimate that the gun had been between 1 inch and 2 feet from Steve when fired. Ultimately, Dr. Sperry was unable to confirm what exactly had happened, and when asked whether it was a homicide or a suicide, the doctor could only note on his report that the manner of death was undetermined. Almost from the get-go, it seemed, there were those who sought to brush Steve's death off as a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and that would add to a lot of chaos and confusion in what was bound to become a highly controversial and frustrating investigation. The crime scene and how it was processed continued to be the subject of controversial debate. One major issue brought up was that of fingerprints. While state police would neither confirm nor deny that the station itself was dusted, Sergeant Herman Silva later explained to the Journal, quote, "It's different when you have a situation where something occurs in a residence, and when you have a place like that, where you have people in and out, you don't exactly know who was in there that day." End quote. One bizarre piece of evidence noted as being at the scene and definitely not dusted for prints was a magazine. Next to where Steve's body had been found, there was a long table, and on it was a copy of the State Law Enforcement Reporter. While the magazine itself wasn't out of place, it's considered extremely curious that it was found open to a page entitled "A Salute to Our Fallen Officers, Sherman L. Toller." Toller was a New Mexico police officer who had been shot to death during a routine traffic stop 2 years earlier. While some use this magazine to suggest that Steve may have been in a depressed state of mind and was admiring how Toller had been hailed as a hero and he wanted the same, thus he must have taken his own life, others believe the magazine may have been left open to that page as a warning to other police officers. This can happen to you too. Chief Carson noted that he was aware Steve and other officers had been receiving anonymous calls and death threats, though he denied having any knowledge of notes left at anyone's home. That same night, as state police were securing and examining the scene, an investigator from the state police and the Attorney General's office decided to move on to Steve's house, just a few blocks away, in search of any information or evidence which might make the picture a little more clear. According to their reports, this search was conducted within hours of the shooting, and in the end, no major pieces of evidence were taken from Steve's house, nor was anything out of the ordinary found. Curiously, while some reports state that this search was conducted by only 2 people, others suggest that Chief Carson himself accompanied them. That's a detail which will become important a little later. Another curious statement was made by Wayne Granger, a medical investigator also present at the scene that night. Granger stated that when he approached Eugene Wright that night to ask him about what he had seen, quote, "He informed this investigator I had to advise him of his rights." End quote. Why exactly Wright felt the need to be Mirandized that night's unknown, especially since he'd already given a handwritten report saying that he had found the body, notified Chief Carson, and waited outside. The day after the shooting, Sunday, May 8th, Mother's Day, Chief Carson, Mayor Shovlin, and Torrance County Undersheriff Gary Watts arrived at Steve's house. Carson phoned Steve's family, who'd been made aware of the terrible tragedy, and requested permission to enter the home, which was granted. When asked about this later, Carson stated that they went to the house because they were worried about the presence of firearms, with Carson saying Steve, quote, "had an interest in guns and so forth. Our concern was, is his house secure?" End quote. According to the Journal, Carson said they were in the home only a short period of time and did not conduct a thorough search. When asked why they had gone to the home after state police and Attorney General's investigators had already been there, Carson claimed that search didn't happen until after he had gone in, though all records show it occurred the night before. The main purpose for the visit came under fire later when Mayor Shovlin was asked about it and gave a completely different reason. Shovlin told the Journal that Steve, quote, "had some animals and we wanted to see if they were okay and to see if there were any signs of him doing himself in," end quote. In regard to Undersheriff Watts, he said he'd only gone to the home because Chief Carson had specifically requested his presence. Watts later stated that the 3 men had been in the home for 5 to 10 minutes and that, during that time, he didn't see any items removed from the house. Watts later told the Journal, quote, "I wish to God I'd never have gone because of the things that's been going on. They asked me to go for whatever reason, I don't know. I guess they asked me so that people couldn't accuse them of hauling stuff out. I just wish I had used better sense." End quote. All of this debate about who searched when becomes immensely important 2 days later on May 10th, the day before Officer Sandlin's funeral. That morning, both Steve's fiancée Michelle and his mother Eileen arrived at the house to collect Steve's belongings. Early on, as they were going through the house, Michelle opened a drawer in the kitchen and discovered 5 freezer bags full of marijuana. The bags were noted as being marked with red and white tape used by law enforcement to label evidence. According to Eileen, she immediately picked up the phone and called Chief Carson to let him know. The discovery made little sense to the family, who knew that investigators had been in the house the night of the crime, and Carson, Shovlin, and Watts had been there the day after. How had no one found the drugs prior to this? Documents from the Attorney General's office later showed that, when dusted for prints, both Steve and Chief Carson's prints were on the bags. Eileen and her husband, Ed Martin, were present when Chief Carson arrived to take the marijuana into evidence, and both stated on the record that Carson said to them, quote, "I'm glad the state boys didn't find this," end quote. Carson, however, denies ever making such a statement and argued he thought the drugs were planted there to make Steve or the department look dirty. I should note, the autopsy showed no traces of illegal substances in Steve's body, and everyone who knew him were adamant that he did not at any time indulge in drugs of any kind. Where things really get crazy is, where exactly did those bags of marijuana come from? Here again, we have an issue with the timeline. Earlier, I explained that upon seizing over 50 pounds of marijuana from the home of Melvin King, the man Steve arrested outside the Rosebud Saloon, 4 trash bags of marijuana were delivered to the Torrance County Sheriff's Office, and at a later time, Under Sheriff Gary Watts transferred the drugs to a locked trailer in the impound lot. Now, Watts stated at least once that the drugs had not been moved from the county jail to the trailer until May 13th. 6 full days after Steve's death. When investigators went to view the trailer on May 18th, it was found that a window had been broken and 3 of the 4 bags had been stolen out of the trailer. Had the drugs been moved on the 13th, then the bags found in Steve's home could not have been the same batch. However, Mayor Richard Shovlin told the Journal that, as far as he knew, the drugs had been stolen before Steve's death, and that Mountainair officials knew this. This has led to a lot of speculation that the drugs found in Steve's home were from this stolen evidence, and it's noted that both Steve and Carson were present at the raid on King's home, and both their fingerprints were on the bags. When asked about this later, then Sheriff Bobby Chavez told the Journal that this had been the first time Mountainair had ever requested that they store evidence for them. Watts, on the other hand, was frustrated, saying, quote, "I wish we'd never accepted that evidence. I made a stupid mistake by moving it out there, but I didn't have any idea it was going to be stolen," end quote. So, who exactly stole the drugs and whether or not the bags found in the home were related has never been answered. Outside of the Sheriff's Department and the Mountainair Police Department, who would have even known where the drugs were being stored in the first place? When pressed on the issue, Watts began raising the possibility that maybe the drugs had never even been given to him in the first place, saying 2 bags only had stems inside and weren't sealed, but the other 2 bags were sealed with evidence tags, so he had never been able to visually verify what was in them. Watts later speculated to the Journal that maybe he had been given dummy bags for reasons unknown. Returning to Steve's home now, the marijuana was not the only inconsistency. According to Eileen, while going through the home, she discovered her son's tape recorder. Reportedly, Steve would hit record and place the recorder in his pocket any time he initiated a traffic stop. While the recorder was there, all of the microcassettes he kept on all of his stops that were recorded had mysteriously disappeared. Initially thinking that the investigators had taken them as evidence, Eileen was shocked to learn that the only piece of physical evidence that the Attorney General's office possessed was Steve's wallet. What became of those tapes has never been determined, nor is the identity of the person who took them. Ivan Riley, a neighbor of Steve's, later told investigators that on the morning of Sunday, May 8th, he witnessed a pickup truck parked outside of the house. He thought it was family members, but none of Steve's family arrived in town until Tuesday, May 10th. Riley also reported seeing Carson, Shovlin, and Watts arriving later in the day, though by this time, the pickup truck was gone. On Wednesday, May 11th, a funeral was held for Officer Stephen Sandlin. Hundreds of locals, family, friends, and police officers turned out to say goodbye. Included amongst the attendees were investigators from the Attorney General's office, as well as members of the Mountainair Town Council. Stephen Sandlin was ultimately laid to rest at Sunset Memorial Park in Albuquerque, beneath a stone etched with his name and badge number 3. Strangely, Steve's funeral announcement, posted in local papers, noted that the 3 other Mountainair police officers would be honorary pallbearers, but in what I can only call a strange turn of events, not a single member of the Mountainair Police Department attended the funeral. While Mayor Shovlin later told the Journal that the officers and Chief Carson didn't attend because they were taking it so hard, Carson himself provided a different reason. Carson said that after Steve's death, he'd spoken to Officers Diaz and Peeler and told them to take a few days to reevaluate things and decide if they still wished to be police officers. Less than a week later, Officer Frank Peeler resigned from the department. No direct reason has ever been given for his resignation, and Peeler has not publicly been interviewed about this case. As for why the chief didn't attend, Carson said he was expecting investigators from the Attorney General's office to speak with him that morning, which seems strange since they attended the funeral. 2 weeks after the death of Officer Sandlin, little new information had come to light. According to investigators' notes, they were able to track down one witness who reported hearing what he believed to be a gunshot in the area near the police station at 7:16 p.m., which falls into the timeline between Steve's call with Michelle, ending at 7:02, and Eugene Wright finding him mortally wounded at 7:45. However, they weren't able to locate any witnesses who saw anyone entering or exiting the station during that time, nor anyone who saw anything through the windows, which didn't have curtains and gave people on the street a pretty clear view of what was going on inside. Eugene Wright had already turned to Fort Hood, and it was there on Wednesday, May 25th, that he would undergo multiple sessions of questioning at the hands of Jerry Gee, a special agent in the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command. For each of these conversations, Gee noted in his reports that Wright willingly waived his rights and was open to discussing the events of May 7th. According to documents obtained by the Albuquerque Journal, during his initial interview with Gee, Wright stated that he had been at the local talent show with the Carson family that night. He returned to the family home with Dolan Carson at approximately 7:15 p.m., where he stayed for 5 to 10 minutes before heading over to the police station. The following day, when Wright returned to speak with Special Agent Gee for a second time, Gee wrote in his notes that the first thing Wright did was change his statement from the previous day, saying that he was not with Dolan Carson at the home prior to going to the police station. At that time, Wright was asked if he was willing to take polygraph examinations, and he agreed to do so. According to Gee's notes, during 2 separate polygraphs, Wright was shown to have been being untruthful when he answered no to the following questions. Did you shoot Steve? Are you now lying to me about the circumstances surrounding Steve's death? Do you know for sure who shot Steve? Were you in the squad room when Steve was shot? When informed that he'd failed on those questions, Gee noted that Wright was emphatic that he had nothing to do with Steve's death and had no idea what had happened. The next time the two would speak was on Friday, May 27th, and Gee decided to take a different approach. This time, he used an easel with large sheets of paper and explained to Wright that he was going to write down specific statements, and he wanted Wright to underline the true statements with a blue pen and the false statements with a red pen. When Gee wrote the sentence, body was found by Butch, he did not answer. Gee informed Wright that failure to answer would mean that he was being untruthful. After a moment, Wright told Gee to underline the sentence in blue, indicating it was true. However, he said he needed to think for a while and would return for more questions at a later date. Gee wrote in his notes that, in his opinion, Wright appeared to be frightened. The two men didn't speak again until more than a week later on Wednesday, June 8th. According to Gee, Wright was being evasive, and he decided to push a little harder, telling him he needed to speak the truth. Gee wrote in his notes, quote, Wright, with some hesitancy, stated that he would go to jail. He was then asked what would happen to him if he continued to lie about this incident. He stated, without hesitancy, he would go to jail. End quote. According to Gee, Wright then explained that he needed to speak with a lawyer about an unrelated matter and would return for questioning at another time. Approximately 1 hour later, Gee notes that he received a call from Deputy Attorney General Steve Westheimer and General Agent Bill Richardson. Gee wrote in his notes, quote, Westheimer suggested my interrogation of Wright may be therapeutic in nature to Wright, which may be inhibiting his interest in speaking the truth. Westheimer suggested I withdraw contact and have someone else inform Wright that the Attorney General's office intended to pursue an indictment of Wright based on the information collected thus far. End quote. Strangely, there's nothing to suggest Wright was questioned either by the Army or New Mexico authorities about the death of Steve Sandlin again until mid-December, more than 6 months later. This time, Wright was called to testify before a grand jury in Estancia on a different matter and was granted use immunity, meaning that anything he told the grand jury he could not be prosecuted for. Westheimer questioned Wright for 4 hours before the grand jury before being dismissed. Later, Wright is on the record telling investigators after the questioning, quote, "You still haven't asked me the right question," end quote. Special Agent Gee had been called to the grand jury as well, but he was never brought to the stand to answer any questions. When later asked about his comment to investigators, Wright told the Journal that the remark could be taken in a lot of different ways, and he was not implying that he was withholding any information. When pressed to discuss what information he did have, Wright only told the reporter, quote, "It's something I'd rather not discuss over the phone," end quote. Wright later acknowledged that he was under the impression he was being looked at as a suspect in the crime. When asked why, he stated, quote, "It's a long story. There's a lot of speculation you could point out. That I'm not from there, that shortly after it happened I left. I was only up there for a short period of time. A lot of other things too." End quote. Approximately 6 months after going before the grand jury, in the summer of 1989, both Eugene Wright and Jerry Gee were sent from Fort Hood to a base in Korea. On September 6th of '88, 4 months after Steve's death, police planned to seize the home of Melvin King, from where they had retrieved the 50 pounds of marijuana that later went missing. This seizure was to be done as the home would be considered subject to forfeiture. Essentially, forfeiture law allows law enforcement to seize property based on the grounds that it may have been connected to a crime. However, 3 weeks later on September 26th, King's home mysteriously burned down due to arson. According to the Carlsbad Courant-Argus, the FBI, who became involved in investigating the fire due to it technically being government-seized property, later noted that the seizure had been specifically requested by Chief Carson. Around this same time, residents of Mountainair presented a petition, with over 200 signatures requesting that both Mayor Shovlin and Chief Carson be removed from their positions. In response, both men argued that locals were angered that they were enforcing the law strictly and that, in the past, Mountainair had been a spot known for lawlessness. On September 21st, a grand jury was impaneled to look into the allegations, though ultimately it was ruled there was nothing to warrant either man's removal, though it should be noted the grand jury stuck to the accusations presented by the petitioners, and as such, there was no discussion of either Steve's death or the disappearance of the marijuana. On Monday, November 7th, the prosecutor's office dropped all charges against Melvin King, which included several traffic violations, resisting arrest, and possession of marijuana with intent to distribute. Susan Sprague's charges were also dropped. According to the prosecutor's office, the traffic charges were dropped because they'd been connected to Officer Sandlin and he could not testify, and the drug charges were dropped because the marijuana had disappeared from the trailer at the Torrance County Sheriff's Department and therefore they didn't have evidence to continue with prosecution. When later interviewed by the Journal, King stated that it had been Police Chief David Carson who had arrested him and not Stephen Sandlin, saying, quote, "I wouldn't know Sandlin if I saw him," end quote. However, King also claimed that Sandlin was in the squad car with Carson during the arrest, which is weird if he doesn't recognize him. When later asked for his whereabouts the night Steve was killed, King couldn't remember where he was or what he was doing that day, but he did specify that he, quote, "distinctly remembers he was not in Mountainair," end quote. This temporary amnesia would not only affect King, but would also extend to Chief Carson himself. The same November that the charges were dropped against King, Chief Carson sat down with investigators from the Attorney General's office to discuss the day of Steve's death. He was asked to specifically lead investigators through the hours leading up to when he received the call that Sandlin had been shot. Carson stated that he met with Steve between 2 and 3 p.m., the discussion which Steve had been angry about later in the day. Following that, Carson proceeded to his home, arriving at approximately 3 p.m., during which time he said he laid down to get some rest. He left his home again at 6 p.m. to begin patrol. At approximately 6:45 p.m., Carson said he arrived at the community center, directly next door to the police station, believing that the talent show was being held there, but upon discovering it was actually at the high school, he then made the 1-mile trip down the road. Carson later told Unsolved Mysteries that 200 to 300 witnesses could place him at the school up until 7:05, but when speaking to investigators, he only noted that he spoke to his wife and Mayor Shevelin. Carson says he left the talent show at approximately 7:05 and proceeded to the residence of Officer Edmundo Diaz, arriving at 7:30 p.m. Carson explained that he did not normally patrol with another officer, though as to why he did this night, he would only say, quote, "There was a reason for that. At this time, I can't discuss it. Periodically, I rode with all the officers," end quote. After picking up Diaz, Carson said that it wasn't long until they got the call and sped over to the station. Carson was then more closely questioned, with investigators wanting information on his whereabouts between 7:05 and 7:30. According to a report obtained by the Journal, Carson, quote, said that he must have experienced a blackout because he couldn't recall where he had been or what he had done during this 25-minute period, end quote. Carson later told the Journal that he never said he blacked out, nor did he say he couldn't recall where he was during this time. This was a very important span of time for two reasons. One being that Officer Sandlin is believed to have been shot between 7:02 and 7:45, and two, investigators spoke with two separate witnesses who claimed to have seen Carson near the police station between 7:18 and 7:25. The first witness stated that he saw Chief Carson driving just north of the station between 7:20 and 7:25. He claims to have seen Carson speaking into his radio before quickly driving in the direction of the station. Moments later, when the witness passed the station, he said that he saw Chief Carson's car parked at an angle approximately 5 feet from the curb next to Sandlin's vehicle. When asked why he'd not come forward sooner, the witness stated that much of the town had been left with the impression that this had been a suicide, and therefore there wasn't any reason to report anything. It wasn't until he read articles later that he realized this was still an open investigation. The second witness stated that he saw the rear of Chief Carson's car parked next to Sandlin's outside the station at approximately 7:18. I think it's important to note that one witness reported hearing gunshots 2 minutes earlier. When the second witness passed the station again 7 minutes later at 7:25, the only police vehicle there was Steve's. Both of these witnesses were asked to take polygraph tests. Both did, and both passed. Mayor Shovlin added more confusion to this timeline as he told investigators he saw both Chief Carson and Officer Diaz at the talent show that night. But Carson himself reported he didn't pick up Diaz until after leaving the talent show. When questioned about their whereabouts on another occasion, both Chief Carson and Officer Diaz told the same story. However, when they were individually asked what route they had taken to arrive at the station that night, each man gave a different route. Diaz later told investigators that Carson appeared to be, quote, very upset when he came to pick him up. For his part, Chief Carson has been emphatic that he does not possess any information about what happened to Steve, nor does he believe that it was a homicide. According to him, Steve was too good of a cop for someone to have snuck up on him, and he was too good with a gun for it to have been an accident. For Chief Carson, the only possible answer is that Steve Sandlin took his own life. The family and those close to Steve feel differently, believing it was murder. Eileen later told the Journal, quote, I'm convinced it had to be someone he knew, someone who could get close to him, end quote. In January of 1989, James Yance resigned from the Attorney General's office, saying he'd had disagreements with his superiors about cases, as well as Steve's, where he felt not all effort was being made to determine what exactly had happened, and he believed investigators decided it had been a suicide and weren't interested in following up on any leads which pointed in different directions. Yance was replaced for a time by James Scarantino, who would have his own issues with his supervisors and the way the case was being handled. 3 months later, on April 27th, Tom Sandlin accepted the Medal of Honor award for his son in a small ceremony hosted by Mayor Shovlin. The award was presented to Sandlin by Chief Carson, and Steve was added to a list of names of officers killed in the line of duty, which would be read at the White House, with Steve being the 159th officer killed the previous year. Tom later spoke through sorrowful pauses, saying, quote, I'd like to say that the void that was created with his passing, this in some ways helps to fill it, end quote. For a year, the family had struggled with the official narrative being suicide, but now with this change, it seemed maybe the wheels of justice would begin moving, and their beloved son's name would have the dark cloud of suspicion removed from it. Steve's fiancée, Michelle Sturdivant, had filed a claim for workers' compensation on behalf of their son Robbie. These benefits are only awarded if it's determined that the victim was hurt or killed in incidents arising out of the course of their work. A letter, issued by a lawyer in the Attorney General's office, called Steve's death a homicide, and this allowed the benefits to be granted. However, this also caused a lot of strife with the Attorney General's office as they had not yet officially ruled anything. They still publicly stated that they could neither prove homicide or suicide based on the evidence they possessed. Steve's mother, though, told the Journal that investigators had told her they were 99% sure this was a homicide. In November of the previous year, former Undersheriff Gary Watts had run for and won the position of Torrance County Sheriff, with the former Sheriff Bobby Chavez taking over his position of Undersheriff. In early May, though, Sheriff Watts and 3 of his officers, Ronald Grist, Alvin Trujillo, and Bruce Warren, were all arrested and booked on suspicion of burglary, larceny, embezzlement, conspiracy, and receiving stolen property. It's important to keep in mind that Watts is the man who stored the marijuana that went missing. These accusations came from a former police officer who alleged that during the time he was a member of the Impact Team, which focuses on drug raids, Watts and his officers had stolen multiple items from the homes they raided, including jewelry, weapons, stereos, and other equipment. For his part, Sheriff Watts denied all charges, but while the investigation was going, he and his 3 officers were put on paid leave and restricted from conducting police duty. That same month of May, two mysterious letters arrived. One was delivered to Steve's mother Eileen, and the other went directly to the Albuquerque Journal. These letters, addressed to the proper authorities, were 2 pages long and had been written with a typewriter and directly named alleged witnesses and suspects while claiming to give an explanation for what exactly happened the night of Steve's murder. The letters read in part, quote, "I'm afraid, very scared if something happens to me before this paper gets to the proper authorities. I hope they are brought to justice, because I do not think Sandlin should have been killed." End quote. The letters had no signature, though at the bottom there was a name typed. When investigators tracked down the man whose name was at the bottom of the letters and questioned him, he denied having written them and interjected that he didn't even know how to use a typewriter. Despite the investigation, the Attorney General's office never determined the author's identity nor the purpose behind the letters. According to investigative notes from the Attorney General's office, they were contacted by an Albuquerque police officer in October of '88, who reported that early in the investigation, when the state police were still in charge, he had delivered what he believed to be an important tip. According to this officer, 1 to 10 days before Sandlin's murder, he was contacted by an informant who told him, quote, "a gringo cop was going to be killed in the mountains," end quote. The reason given was allegedly because the cop wouldn't accept bribes from local drug runners. When asked why he was bringing this information to Albuquerque, the tipster stated that he could not trust the police in the mountains. Unfortunately, the tip had been so vague, not listing a city, county, or agency, there was little that could be done. However, when Steve was killed days later, this police officer says he immediately contacted the state police, but his tip was disregarded because as far as they were concerned, this had been a suicide, not a homicide. The state police denied any knowledge of this tip, with Sergeant Herman Silva telling the Journal that after more than a year had passed, he couldn't remember off the top of his head whether or not he'd even heard that tip. When asked if any of his officers might have had knowledge of the tip, Silva replied, quote, "After the death, I remember something being mentioned. I'm not saying I didn't talk to him. It's possible. It could have happened." End quote. Silva was adamant, though, that he would not have dismissed the tip because, in his own words, quote, "One thing I can tell you, my reports, anything I wrote, does not call it a suicide. I don't think I ever told him that. All my reports say it was undetermined." End quote. When asked if this tip would have been passed along to the Attorney General's office once they took over, he vaguely replied, quote, "That information may have been exchanged, or maybe it may not have." End quote. The Attorney General's office made it clear they had no knowledge of this tip until October, when the officer contacted them, having learned that they were now in charge of the investigation. In what I can only call a bizarrely cold and strange statement, Silva also explained to the Journal that he couldn't quite understand why a year later he was still being asked about this case, saying, quote, "I've never seen anyone receive as much publicity in a case as this one. For some reason, this keeps coming up, and why, I don't know, but there's a lot of homicides and suicides that occur in other parts of the state." End quote. Just as a personal note here, God forbid anything should ever happen to me, please ensure this man is not in charge of the investigation. In July of 1989, the Albuquerque Journal was contacted by an unnamed source who claimed to possess further information about the murder of Steve Sandlin. The source told the Journal that he received an anonymous phone call 2 weeks after the murder, telling him to go to a convenience store in Albuquerque's Northeast Heights. At 11 p.m., after waiting 30 minutes, the source claimed he was going to make a phone call, and in the booth he found a note with his name on it, directing him to a remote location outside Estancia in Torrance County. At the location specified in the note, he found a small box that contained an unloaded .357 Magnum. The source said he thought the weapon should be in the hands of law enforcement, and he mailed it to investigator Westheimer the next morning. A week later, the same source claimed to have received an anonymous call from a woman who stated that the weapon he'd been given was in fact involved in Steve's death. The Attorney General's office, however, denied ever receiving the gun, nor having any knowledge of this source or any information he might provide. Attorney General Hal Stratton, when asked by the Journal, appeared to be completely unaware, saying, quote, "You need to check your sources. As far as we know, everything about that is a total fabrication." End quote. When asked if indeed the gun found at the murder scene, Sandlin's .357, was in fact the murder weapon, Stratton stated that they would not discuss the details of an ongoing investigation. At this point in July of '89, the case was being investigated solely by the Attorney General's office, but that was all about to change, as Nora Jean Flanagan, an assistant attorney general in the criminal section of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, ordered that the FBI open an independent investigation into Steve's death. According to the Department of Justice, they became involved in the case following a phone call from Senator James Caudell, whose district includes Mountainair. When asked by the Journal what caused him to make this request, Caudell explained, quote, "The people of Mountainair didn't feel they're getting a proper investigation into the Sandlin murder by law enforcement agencies in New Mexico. It's not what I thought it should be. I'm talking about all the state agencies who at some time or other have been investigating. The feedback I've been getting from people in Mountainair is that the investigation is not what it should be." End quote. DA Stratton was displeased, telling reporters that, as far as he was concerned, they were doing everything they possibly could to solve the case. Interestingly, James Caudell would not be the only senator speaking up about Steve's death. Mississippi Senator Trent Lott would also get involved, although his reason came from a more personal location. F.J. Turnage had been a resident of Mountainair and even served on the town council during '87 and '88. Turnage later stated in an interview that his wife received an anonymous call from a woman saying that if they didn't leave Mountainair by December 1st, they would be killed. Turnage, who didn't want to get into specifics, told the Journal that there had been several incidences which made him believe that the threat was legitimate. Turnage and his wife fled Mountainair on December 1st, arriving in Mississippi, where he spoke with his second cousin, Senator Lott, who personally placed a call to FBI Director William Sessions. Turnage later stated that he also told Westheimer about the threat and was told to stay out of town until things settled down. Perhaps what's most important to note here is the specific area of the Justice Department that got involved. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division can get involved in a local murder investigation only if there is reason to believe the victim was or would have been a witness in a federal case, or if the victim was killed by someone in law enforcement. Again, I think that bears repeating. Only if the victim was going to be a federal witness or was a federal witness or was killed by someone in law enforcement. Could this have anything to do with what Steve may have told investigators the day before he was murdered, or is it more about the possibility that his killer may have worn a badge? When Sheriff Watts was made aware of the FBI investigation, he told reporters he would happily cooperate with them, though he didn't think he had any helpful information to provide. Watts stated, quote, "There's no connection between Steve Sandlin's death and myself. I would like to see Steve Sandlin's death solved, and I think that would be better done by the FBI than the Attorney General. With the FBI involved, it will remove any politics." End quote. Watts argued that his arrest by the Attorney General's office had been done to apply pressure to him regarding the Sandlin investigation, though he claimed to know nothing about that crime. As the FBI began their investigation, they were given information from both the Attorney General's office and the state police. 2 months later, in September of '89, James Scarantino, the prosecutor who had replaced James Yance, was fired from the Attorney General's office for unspecified reasons. Scarantino stated that when he asked why he was being terminated, he was told they didn't have to give him a reason. In October, Scarantino and Yount sat down for an interview with the Albuquerque Journal, where they expressed their beliefs that both had been forced out of their jobs for trying to investigate Sandlin's death, accusing their former supervisors of impeding the investigation and looking to close the book on it and label it a suicide. They accused the Attorney General's office of chewing out investigators for questioning potential witnesses and pursuing leads, as well as removing investigators from the case when they got too close to an answer. Both former prosecutors told the Journal that the Attorney General's office has in its files evidence that, quote, people engaged in illegal drug trafficking conspired to kill Officer Sandlin, end quote. It was alleged that a list of suspects had existed from the early days of the investigation, and that more than a year later, no names had been removed or added to that list. The Attorney General's office denied that they'd done anything to throw the investigation off course or that they were viewing the death as a suicide, saying that from day one they'd investigated the case as an unexplained shooting. Yount and Scarantino stated that requests to interview known drug dealers in the area were denied, and that inquiries into the missing marijuana from Torrance County were also disallowed. They added that they were not allowed to travel out of state to interview the girlfriend of Eugene Wright, and that when an Army intelligence officer began making headway in his interrogation of Wright, he was ordered to stop questioning him, which we know is true based on documents discussed earlier. In addition to those accusations, the two men stated that they were barred from using tape recorders during interviews with persons of interest. Westheimer actually confirmed this in a statement, telling the Journal, quote, our investigators all went through a training program on interviewing and interrogation techniques within the last year. It was decided, and the trainer from New York concurred, with the policy of not tape recording interviews, end quote. James Yount accused the investigators of working to put up barricades, saying, quote, under the auspices of supervising an investigation, the investigation was in effect thwarted. Any time things started getting very, very close to finding out pertinent information, the investigators were precluded from doing it, and Gillespie and Westheimer took over, end quote. That same month of October, Socorro County District Attorney Lee Deschamps told reporters that he was strongly considering opening his own investigation into the death of Officer Sandlin. Deschamps had stayed out of the investigation early on because he'd been told this was more than likely a tragic case of suicide. But now he felt his own residents were asking questions, and with potential connections in Socorro County, he needed to determine whether or not he could launch an investigation without interfering with the FBI or Attorney General. By this time, 3 months into their investigation, the FBI would only state that they had found no compelling evidence of homicide, but they had not yet ruled it out either. Also now added to the mix comes Unsolved Mysteries, when a producer came to New Mexico conducting interviews with Steve's family, as well as FBI Special Agent in Charge James Nelson. In March of 1990, the Journal released a long article after obtaining documents from the Attorney General Office's investigation, and several startling revelations were noted. Firstly, it was shown that agents and prosecutors who had tried to reconstruct the moment of Steve's death had run into conflicting witness testimony and inconsistent physical evidence, making it incredibly difficult to determine what exactly happened that night. Beyond that, the actions of some law enforcement officials and residents of Mountainair were coming under scrutiny with the belief that they had more information than they were sharing about May 7th. While the Attorney General's office would not offer comment, the FBI repeated that they had yet to uncover any evidence to prove that Steve's death had been a homicide. Another compelling account came when investigators interviewing someone on an unrelated matter steered the conversation towards Steve Sandlin. Reportedly, this person, who has never been named, told investigators that they had been directly told by a police officer that he had in fact shot and killed Steve Sandlin. Reportedly, the officer told the witness, quote, if he had kept his nose out of things, he'd be better off. Sandlin wouldn't have died, end quote. It was said that Steve's death was directly related to trafficking of marijuana in the East Mountain area of Torrance County. Documents showed that within days of receiving this report, James Scarantino, then working for the AG's office, was planning to investigate, but was instead fired. Following his termination, 2 investigators were removed from the case. In addition to this, files showed, and Chief Carson himself confirmed, that he had been given a polygraph examination by the FBI. While both Carson and Agent Nelson confirmed the chief of police passed his test, they wouldn't reveal what questions he was actually asked. Other details in the document showed that investigators were trying to track down a mystery woman, possibly the one Steve argued with prior to his death, maybe the one who had made anonymous calls to the witnesses with the second gun or threats to F.J. Turnage and his wife. Perhaps they could all have been the same woman. As far as has ever been reported, she's never been tracked down or identified. Investigators were also trying to locate the owner of an older model, full-size white truck seen parked outside the police station at approximately 7:16 p.m. the night Steve was killed. In hopes that reviews might aid the investigation, Dr. Thomas Canfield, a forensic pathologist out of Colorado, was asked by the Attorney General's office to review Steve's autopsy to see if he could shed any light on the manner of his death, though Dr. Canfield was not allowed to discuss any details with the media. The FBI took a similar line, sending X-rays and other materials to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. for a review. The Attorney General's office also consulted with scientists at Los Alamos National Lab for help with how Steve was shot. Ultimately, the scientists determined that, quote, the bullet struck Sandlin in the head as he was ducking away from the gun, end quote. This information was coupled with a thorough check of Steve's background, which found that there was little stress in his life and he showed no signs of a tendency towards suicide. Internal memos showed that the Attorney General's office, while not saying so publicly, had all but discounted the possibility of suicide or an accident. Documents dated April 1989 showed that Dr. Chris Sperry believed the wound was, quote, not self-inflicted. In August of '89, Dr. Sperry told reporters that the wound was not, quote, inconsistent with suicide, but the reason for saying this was an attention-grabbing one, to say the least. Dr. Sperry explained, quote, if someone wanted to kill someone, they could do it in this manner and make it look like suicide, end quote. Then there's the details about the crime scene that didn't make any sense. Firstly, at the time of his death, Steve Sandlin was wearing a bulletproof vest, which seems inconsistent with suicide. Although, if you go back and listen to episode 48, The Mysterious Death of Chuck Morgan, you'll hear another bizarre story about an alleged suicide committed by a man wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a .357 Magnum. Beyond that, tests on Sandlin's hand showed very minor amounts of gunpowder residue. FBI agent Nelson later stated that the amount found was, quote, not enough to conclude it was fired by his hand, end quote. Nelson also noted that no fingerprints of value were found on Sandlin's service revolver. Perhaps most bizarre and inconsistent of all, Steve was right-handed and was shot on the right side of his head. Based upon the position of his body at the time he was found, this should have resulted in the bullet forcing blood and matter to eject to his left. However, blood and other matter was discovered on the wall to his right. In addition to that, while some fragments of the bullet, which had shattered, lodged in his brain, other fragments and matter were found lodged in the ceiling. Finally, and perhaps most disturbing of all, was a major discrepancy with the timeline. Eugene Wright said he found Steve at 7:45 p.m. Carson, however, said he'd arrived right after the call at 7:30. The ambulance wasn't called until 7:50. Was Carson wrong with the time he arrived, or was Sandlin left dying on the floor of the police station for perhaps upwards of 20 minutes before anyone called for help? In February of 1990, 3 days before Sheriff Watts was set to go to trial, the Attorney General's office dropped all charges against him. This apparently stemmed from an interview with the sheriff where he was not Mirandized, and therefore any information divulged during that discussion became inadmissible. While Watts was free to go, his undersheriff, former Sheriff Bobby Chavez, was then indicted on charges of using department credit cards and vehicles for his own personal use. I mean, pardon my language, but this entire county was a clusterfuck, and I don't know how anyone was ever arrested and convicted of any crime during this time in Torrance County. 1 month later, in March, David Carson was officially out as Mountainair Chief of Police. New Mayor Carl Ivey was elected after Richard Shovelin chose not to pursue re-election. On an early conversation Ivey had with Carson, the chief asked if he wanted his resignation. While Ivey stated that he said yes, Carson claimed he didn't actually offer his resignation and said he would need to think about it. Carson then began arguing that he'd been fired without the approval of the town council, and it all became a matter of he said. Allegedly, Carson contacted Ivey and told him he'd need to receive his benefits immediately as he wanted to leave town as soon as possible. And then, for the most part, it all went quiet. No more information about the Attorney General's investigation, no more interviews with police chiefs and sheriffs. Everything seemed to just fade for a time. And over the course of the next 5 years, the county and the town worked hard to straighten out their image, to correct their mistakes, to find justice. Still, it would take until 1995, 7 years after his death, before new Attorney General Tom Udall publicly confirmed that Stephen Sandlin had been the victim of a homicide, and he was then added as name number 105 to the state's memorial to officers slain in the line of duty. Tom Sandlin was emotional with the announcement, telling the Journal, quote, "His sacrifice hadn't been in vain. He's remembered finally. It's the start of our family recovery." End quote. Soon, days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. 18 years to be precise. The investigation, it appeared, had hit a wall, and whoever had been responsible was still out there, free to live a life they had stolen from Steve Sandlin. It seemed justice might be unreachable for some, though despite the passage of time, the hope remained that those responsible would one day find themselves in cuffs, charged with murder. No one forgot Steve, and to ensure no one ever would, in May of 2013, 25 years after his murder, a 4-foot-tall plaque bearing Steve's image and name, rank and badge, was added as a tribute to the fallen officer, right in the front courtyard of the very police station in which he had worked, in which he was murdered. Tom Sandlin attended alongside his grandson Robbie, who was then 26 years old, 5 years older than his father had ever gotten the chance to be. A few years later, in 2018, a large fire broke out in the building, destroying much of the police department as it had once been. Following construction efforts, a new Mountainair police station was unveiled on Saturday, May 4th, 2019. Tom Sandlin, his wife Yvonne, and Robbie were present for this special event, in which the ribbon cutting revealed the new building, now named the Stephen A. Sandlin Memorial Police Station. 33 years have passed since Officer Stephen Sandlin was shot and killed in the line of duty on Saturday, May 7th, 1988. For more than 3 decades, questions have lingered about who may have pulled the trigger and why. While the passage of time can easily make it appear that justice will never arrive, so many difficult and complicated cases thought unsolvable have found their answers through hard work, advances in technology, and the dedication of those charged with finding the truth. While some whose names have been the subject of speculation have since moved on from this life, the truth itself remains out there somewhere, and more than likely, There are those who once lived in Mountainair, or still do, who could provide those answers and deliver closure to a family which has suffered far too long without them. At the dedication of the Stephen A. Sandlin Memorial Police Station, Mayor Pete Nieto spoke of Stephen and why they decided to memorialize him this way. I'll now play a clip of Mayor Nieto discussing Stephen, his life, and the community hope that someday justice will be delivered and closure might be discovered. And then we'll move into the theories.
On May 7th, 1988, tragedy struck the town of Mountainair. I was less than 2 years old at the time. However, growing up in Mountainair, it was a story that was often told. Stephen was a wonderful public servant, just starting out on this venture called life. A new child, a new job, a young man only 21 years old, and had everything going for him. And then a day that I know we all wish that would have never happened. A horrible tragedy that would alter a town, a family, and many lives. While we were discussing the future of the department, we knew we wanted to keep Stephen's memory alive. I had a vision for the police department when I was elected mayor, but that vision began to morph while I learned more about Stephen. You see, Stephen wanted to do his part to help this beautiful town, and the vision I had for the police department began to be modeled after Stephen A. Sandlin. We would integrate his qualities into our department, a high standard of respect, of integrity, of kindness, and one that had a very clear goal of helping the town of Mountainair and its residents. The Stephen A. Sandlin Memorial Police Station will have features that will give both Torrance County Sheriff's deputies and New Mexico State Police officers a place to work when they are in Mountainair, further increasing teamwork and cooperation between the three departments. I want to thank the family of Stephen who have joined us here today. This coming Tuesday will be 31 years since the passing of Stephen. To many in attendance here, I'm sure it does not quite seem like it was that long ago. And to his family, I'm sure like it seems like it was just yesterday. I cannot imagine the heartbreak you experienced on that day and the days since. Your son, your father, your brother gave his life for this town. The town owes you this station so that his memory will live on forever. I ask everyone in attendance today to do what we can, including praying, to bring closure to this family. The town of Mountainair, the county of Torrance, and the state of New Mexico owe you, the family of Stephen, closure. I continue to hope and pray that it will be brought to you sooner rather than later. I like to think that Stephen is looking down on us today, knowing that we want him to be a wonderful memory in Mountainair, even long after any of us are even here.
We've discussed a lot of difficult, complex, and frustrating cases over the past 166 episodes, but the murder of Officer Stephen Sandlin may be one of the most complicated and multifaceted of them all. A 21-year-old father who dreamed his entire life of being a cop, of following in his own father's footsteps, finally achieves that dream, and where he expected to find justice, honor, and law, he instead discovered betrayal, deceit, and corruption. Just 8 weeks after taking the job, he's shot and killed in cold blood in the same station he worked in. Nobody sees anything, nobody hears anything, nobody has an answer, and those who work side by side with him seem disinterested in finding the truth. There's a wide cast of characters involved, from drug traffickers to fellow law enforcement officers. It runs the gamut. How exactly does a man get shot with his own weapon inside the walls of a police department at the center of town without someone noticing before the sun even set? An investigation mired in politics, accusations of corruption, drug traffickers, and poor choices ultimately leads nowhere. In 33 years, the only answer that's ever been provided is that Stephen Sandlin was most assuredly the victim of a homicide, targeted for death by someone or a group of people who believed his dedication to the job and belief in justice would threaten their own underhanded activities. There's never been a suspect publicly named in this case, but there are names which have been speculated about for years. Melvin King, the man whose arrest by Steve led to the seizure of more than 50 pounds of marijuana, bagged and ready for sale, and over 100 potted plants. King was a dangerous man with a short temper and a quick fuse. Following Steve's death, All charges against him were dropped as Steve wasn't there to testify, and the evidence gathered from his home mysteriously disappeared. There's a lot of people who believe to this day that King had to have been involved in the murder, and they certainly have plenty of reason to think so. I suppose the question becomes, could Melvin King have possessed the ability to barge into the police station, overpower Stephen, pull his service revolver and fire without anyone seeing him in the town, at the station, or in the area? How could he have known Stephen was at the station that night alone and maybe vulnerable? Sure, he could have followed the rookie, plotted out his movements, formulated a plan, and had the brazen insanity to execute that plan without making a single mistake, without leaving behind anything to suggest his culpability. I've often wondered during that final phone call Steve had with his fiancée, what if the woman who came up arguing with Steve wasn't really looking for City Hall? I mean, honestly, it's on the first floor. It's pretty hard to miss. What if she'd been sent to check, to make sure he was there, alone, and upon walking down the stairs and out of the station, she gave a little signal, maybe to Melvin, maybe to someone else? Strange, isn't it? After all these years, they've never managed to identify who that woman was that came to the station. You'd imagine if she was just a citizen, someone who hadn't been involved, she might pick up the phone and let police know why she was there, what she might have seen. It's difficult to imagine she didn't hear about the case on the news or read it in the paper. So why not come forward unless you've got something to hide? Of course, if we're looking at Melvin King, then I've got a few questions that I'm not sure this suspect can supply the answers for. Stephen was good at his job. He knew who King was because he'd arrested him before. I find it difficult to believe that he'd see King come walking into the station and he'd just take it casually and turn his back to him. So how would King have gotten his hands on the gun without there being some kind of a struggle, a fight, something where Stephen might have gotten a few punches in? We know Stephen had injuries to his face, but they can never determine if those came from when he fell to the floor or through some other means. One expert speculated that maybe Stephen had been struck with something before being shot. That could fit. It might explain why it seems that at the time the gun was fired, Steve was kneeling, bending, trying to get out of the way. The shot went in towards the upper part of the right side of his head. Could he have been trying to stand back up after being knocked down? Investigators said there was no sign of a struggle, and by all accounts, Stephen's uniform wasn't ripped or stretched out. It didn't appear that he'd been in a fight for his life moments earlier. Many believe that someone managed to sneak up into the police station that night, catching the young officer off guard, but there's a few problems with that too. There was only one way in and one way out, and that way led to a set of old wooden steps that creaked and cracked as weight was applied to them. While soft steps might have hidden the thumps normal steps would echo out, those creaks and pops are going to respond regardless. You ever try to sneak up an old wooden staircase, maybe coming home late when you were a teen? How often do you hear that creaking and cracking, and how loud does it sound to you? Even if someone made it up the stairs silently, how would they get to Steve before he saw them coming? Based on witnesses, there were people in the area all throughout the hour during which the murder occurred. One person heard a shot at 7:16. A white truck was spotted at the station around the same time, though the owner's never been ID'd. I'd like to imagine if Melvin King drove a white truck, someone would have figured that out during the investigation. I'd also really like to know if the truck Steve's neighbor, Ivan Riley, saw at his house the next day was white or not. For some reason, no color is specified in any account of what he saw that day, and while I find that strange in this case, it's fucking par for the course. I suppose you have to look to motive. So for King, perhaps that motive could have been to kill the officer who had led to him being the subject of a major drug bust. The problem there is, even if Stephen was killed, that drug prosecution was still going to happen. The only thing that stopped it was when the evidence was stolen, some of which may have later been planted in Steve's house as a message or to make him seem corrupt, to taint his reputation. The question becomes, could Melvin King have orchestrated the theft of the marijuana from the locked trailer in the sheriff's impound lot without someone telling him it was there? Allegedly, it had been stored in the jail before, But then again, the entire timeline of where the drugs were at any given time is so convoluted and confused, there's no real way of knowing what the hell happened with it. But was King the only one who might have seen the value in those pounds of marijuana? Those who knew Steve best, his parents, fiance, siblings, none of them ever believed the possibility of suicide. However, when it came to homicide, there's a fairly common belief that whoever pulled the trigger would likely have been someone Steve knew, someone he thought he could trust. The Attorney General's office were investigating accusations that, among other things, the Mountainair Police Department were not properly handling evidence. Less than 24 hours before being killed, Stephen spoke to investigators for a good period of time. Did he just answer questions they asked, or, being a good cop he was, did he mention some things he'd seen that worried him or concerned him? The last time he spoke to his father, he made it clear something was wrong and he wasn't sure what to do about it. This has led to a lot of speculation that maybe Stephen Sandlin mentioned the possibility that evidence wasn't being improperly handled, it was being stolen. Stephen was receiving death threats almost from the moment he joined the force, along with his friend Frank Peeler. Sheriff Watts later alleged that he too received threats from a cop representing traffickers who warned him to back off the drug busts. Who was the cop? Was that story even true? We don't know. But we do know the threats against Sandlin were legitimate, scary enough for him to be afraid to be home alone at night, and eventually those making the threats made good on them, and a young life with so much promise was extinguished. So if we're going to turn our attention towards the possibility that someone in law enforcement could have been involved, then where do you start but with the chief? I think it's worth noting that this is not the only murder where the name David Carson comes up. There's another in Louisiana. 18-year-old Eric Prudhomme was arrested and charged with the February 11th, 1991 murders of Pam and Eric Allender. 17 days later, Prudhomme was found hanging in the jail showers, having left behind a note confessing that he and he alone had committed the murders and, sickeningly, that he enjoyed them. As it turns out, the Calcasieu Parish jailer who let Prudhomme into the showers that night was David Carson. There were accusations that Prudhomme was murdered, that false statements were handed out for prisoners to sign, but nothing much ever came of it. There's not enough there to really say one way or another, but it's interesting that 3 years after the death of Steve Sandlin, Carson finds himself named in a potential connection to another alleged murder plot conspiracy cover-up. But let's stick with New Mexico, where we've got a lot more information. It's difficult to get a sense of what people really thought of Carson. He was appointed chief of police by the town council in 1987 and grew friendly with the mayor, Richard Shovlin. Shovlin thought highly of Carson, but clearly residents didn't, as they put together petitions to try and get both men removed from their positions with accusations of harassment and negligence. One detail that came out that still surprises me is that David Carson was not always his name. Until 1983, his legal name was David Joseph Shanklin, and strangely enough, at the time he was appointed chief of police, he had an outstanding warrant for contempt of court in Ohio, though that warrant doesn't cross state lines. When asked why he changed his name, Carson explained that his father married his ex-wife. Yes, the father married the son's ex-wife, so he changed his name to put the past behind him, or so he says. He also had a history of misdemeanor arrests. Hamilton County, Ohio has records of Shanklin/Carson being charged with 6 misdemeanors between 1963 and 1973. 2 of the 6 charges, noted as being for assault and non-support, were ultimately dismissed. 3 of the charges relating to passing bad checks were handled through the payment of fines and court costs. The final charge resulted in Carson being found guilty of abuse of family in 1963. When asked about this, Carson said he attributed the charge to, quote, a bad first marriage that haunts me continually, end quote. Gee, I feel really sorry for him. When Carson was appointed chief, he'd only been involved in law enforcement for 2 years. He worked in 1985 as a jailer in Hobbs, New Mexico. He became certified to be a police officer in New Mexico in June of 1987, and 3 months later he was chief of police in Mountainair. His prior background includes work in private investigation, bail bonds, and security. So, on the one hand, part of me feels like he can't possibly have acquired the skills and abilities to completely manipulate this situation with such confidence in such a short amount of time, but then again, even a broken watch is right twice a day. But let's throw out everything we know about Carson and his background, and let's just put our attention on what we know for sure. It was Carson who sent Sandlin to the station that night rather than out on patrol like he would have preferred to have been after a discussion. Now, Carson says it wasn't heated. It wasn't an argument, but if it had been a screaming situation, would he have told investigators that in the aftermath of Steve's death? That's hard to say. Carson surely knew Steve was there, alone, at the station, and he'd be there until Officer Peeler showed up, at which time the two of them would be working security at the town dance. When asked where he was between 7 and 7:30, he explained that he was picking up Officer Diaz, even though he made it clear he didn't commonly ride along with other officers. When asked why he did this night, he never gave a solid answer. Diaz said Carson seemed very upset when he picked him up that night, though it doesn't appear there was any additional information about what Diaz thought might have made him upset or how he behaved afterwards. Carson says he was at the talent show, then went to pick up Diaz. Shovlin says both Diaz and Carson were at the talent show. When asked what route they took to the police station that night, Carson and Diaz provided alternate routes. All right, it had been a year. Maybe they didn't remember everything exactly. But two witnesses who passed polygraphs reported seeing Carson near or parked at the station during the time where he says he wasn't there. He does put himself in the area once, right around 6:45, when he says he arrived at the building next to the station, mistakenly believing that's where the talent show was being held. To me, that's a bit strange, if for no reason other than that's where the dance was going to be. Now, you could definitely look at this information and convince yourself that Carson was involved in some way. I mean, he kind of fit what we're looking for. Someone who could get into the station without drawing attention, someone who could approach Stephen without him suspecting anything, someone familiar with the service revolver and what a homicide looks like versus a suicide, someone who would have had access to evidence which may or may not have gone missing over time, someone who at the end of all things was the least likely person to be considered a suspect without something much more solid than rumor and speculation. But his tie into this crime doesn't really just end with him. According to his own statements, Eugene Butch Wright was the first person on the scene and found Stephen lying face down in a pool of blood. Wright was good friends with Carson's son. They were in the military together and he was in town visiting when all this happened. Wright ran out of the station, opened Steve's cruiser door, and radioed for Carson. He didn't say anything about someone being shot, blood, needing an ambulance. According to Carson, he arrived less than a minute later, and Wright and Diaz went up into the station with him, finding Steve mortally wounded. If that's how it all went down, then why did Wright seem hesitant to tell his story? Why did he first tell the Army investigator that he was with Carson's son, and then the next day change it to say he was by himself? Why did he ask to be Mirandized before answering a medical investigator's questions? Why did he fail 2 polygraphs specifically on questions related to the murder? And why did he say that if he told the truth, he would go to jail? On the one hand, you could easily say perhaps he and Carson had something going on, that he was involved in this crime despite his claims, but on the other, what if it went down in a way that no one's considered? Wright and Sandlin were kind of friends. They chatted, hung out, and Wright went on ride-alongs with the rookie officer. What if this was an accident, but not one committed by Sandlin? I've often found myself considering the possibility that Wright and Sandlin could have been joking around. Allegedly, Sandlin would sometimes play with his gun. What if maybe Wright twirled the gun and it went off? Or Wright had the gun and Sandlin was all, "Stop screwing around, don't point that gun at me." And as he ducked out of the way, not wanting the gun there, it goes off. Now, I've got no evidence to support that. It's all speculation. But so much of this case is just that. Maybe that's why no one ever asked the right question, because it wasn't a question of intentional homicide, but one of pure accident. I guess the question would be, if that did happen, would Wright have lied to Carson, or would Carson perhaps have been willing to help cover it up? Those answers we may never know. There's so many different angles to this case, so many different possibilities, it's not all that easy to try and narrow things down. What you have to ask yourself is, who would have had the most reason to want to see Steve dead? A chief of police who might have protected a friend of his son's, or perhaps was tied into illegal activities in the area, or who tried to rein in an overzealous rookie before he crossed the wrong person? Maybe. On the Officer Down memorial page for Stephen Sandlin, there's one comment which stands out, one that grabs attention. The problem is, from what I can tell, it's never been verified, so it's hard to know if the author is actually who they claim to be. I'm going to read it to you because I think it's worth hearing, but note, I cannot prove this is true. This comment was posted on July 7th, 2014 and reads, quote, "To whom it may concern, it's sad Dave Carson got away with Steve's murder. I'm a stepson of Dave Carson, and his real name is Dave Shanklin. I can't stand him myself. If I can help in any way possible, please contact me." End quote. I admit it's a tantalizing statement, but there's nothing to back it up. For the record, I did send an email to the address the poster listed, but I never got an answer. So, while you can see something dark going on with Carson, at the same time you've got to consider he could have been completely innocent, uninvolved, and just as confused as everyone else. I do think it's worth noting that regardless of what you think of Carson, he was never indicted for any crime in the state of New Mexico, no charges that were later dropped, no direct accusation of any illegal activities, and in the years since, he hasn't been charged or arrested for anything else either. Look, I'm not the guy you go to if you want to sell a half-assed conspiracy. I need facts, evidence, witnesses. I don't just sign on the dotted line because it's interesting or fascinating. There's a lot of really popular theories out there on all sorts of cases that I don't buy. But if you told me this was a case of corruption, of cover-up, I don't need a huge arsenal to argue against it. The problem is, by who and for what purpose? Drug traffickers and corrupt police? Fine, but are we talking about Mountainair police, state police, sheriff's department? I mean, Torrance County had a lot of crazy stuff going on around this time, and that's part of the problem. This investigation dug into so many different avenues and peripheral situations that it's remarkably difficult to find which way is up once you're in the middle of it. And maybe that's somewhat the point. Perhaps someday we'll get the answers. Someone in New Mexico, someone who lived in Mountainair or still does, they know what happened there. Things like this don't stay buried, they don't remain hidden. People talk, rumors spread, and you begin to get an understanding of what went down. The problem is that speculation and rumor can also function as a sort of security blanket. With so many different accusations flying around, it becomes difficult to prove one over the other, especially when there's no hard evidence which can be linked to any of it. And I suppose that's where you come in, listeners, to spread awareness of this story. Lies and deceit can only survive in the dark. The more you expose them to light, the greater the chance that something's going to break, that someone's going to speak up or get scared and say something they didn't intend to. It's been 33 years since Officer Sandlin was shot and killed. He was 21 years old. His life hadn't even really begun, and in the blink of an eye, it was all destroyed. His son had to grow up without him. His fiancée had to hold their 19-month-old son as they laid Stephen to rest. 3 decades is far too long to go without answers, to go without the truth. Steve's parents are still out there, his siblings, his son, with no true taste of justice. Unfortunately, though, unless someone comes forward, new evidence is discovered, or technology can somehow lend a hand in breaking this case, the murder of Officer Stephen Sandlin will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the murder of Officer Stephen Sandlin, there are many archive news articles discussing this case. The Albuquerque Journal did extensive coverage, and without their hard work, this episode would not have been possible. The Trail Went Cold has covered this case, and Unsolved Mysteries also aired a segment about it. If you have any information about the murder of Officer Stephen Sandlin, please contact the Mountainair Police Department at 505-384-2785. 2705. You can also contact Albuquerque Metro Crime Stoppers at 505-843-STOP. That's 505-843-7867. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Trace Evidence would not be possible without support from amazing listeners like you. And now I'd like to take a moment to thank our fantastic Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Anne Bertram, Aurora K, Bacon Bits the Cat, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, Dave Allen, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eric Sumter, Guillermo Pinto, Heather Louise, James, Jen Trebb, Jennifer Winkler, Joni Berkowitz, Kara Moreland, Marla Wright, Melissa Breckisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Orange Patches, Quinn McBreen, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Levonen, Sarah Mascaritolo, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tom Archer, Tom Radford, Tracy Woods, and Walter Jansen. Your contributions to Trace Evidence are invaluable, and your support of the show is both appreciated and extremely humbling. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence and gaining access to exclusive merch and ad-free episodes, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or go to trace-evidence.com and click on the support option. That's going to conclude this week's episode. If you haven't already, please consider rating the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. 5 stars would be greatly appreciated, but it's up to you. Share these episodes, spread the word, and maybe together we can help bring justice to those who have been deprived of it. Thank you all once again for listening, supporting the show, and for being the best listeners a podcaster could ask for. Thank you again for listening to this episode, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.